So with the costume textures, we're going to start out with that shoulder piece that we UV'd initially. Um, One thing about this process is that I made a texture early on in the production or development of this production, and wasn't quite what we were looking for, but it's a good base that I can get started off. So um, it's just basically a gray leather texture that I made, and I'll include what I have on the DVD. But it's very simple. Just you could make it with just any leather texture, and I'm going to be using it as a base for the sort of the color for all the pieces, and we'll definitely get into that later. But just wanted to say that it's a very simple texture, and we're going to be dealing with it a lot. Um, so it's just a starting point, and this chapter is going to be extremely long, and I don't want to um, do too simple stuff on it, and I want to get straight into it. So we're going to get straight into it, and we're going to do the shoulder first. So we're just going to render what that texture looks like currently, and we'll have an idea of what where we're going and what it's going to be doing. Flipping through all kinds of renders there. I don't know what's going on. But let's just render this color pass and see what's happening. So that's what it looks like. Everything else is a blend, so it's getting shading information. The Nexus only respects the preview options. So that's kind of how I was doing it. I was doing kind of a gray leather, really basic, with a little bit of wearing around the edges. And we're going to go in and do all that wearing painting on a couple of the objects later. It's going to all be custom painted. So, but this is just kind of a cue for where we're going. Right now I want to just do a simple procedural bump, because I think all these pieces, there's so many pieces that on this thing that we don't want to get into having to do a bump map for every single one. So if there's 70% of them being a leatherish texture or synthetic, those should all have the same bump map. And we'll just do it procedurally. So I just made a leather texture, very simple, and didn't really change it much. Made a few scale changes. And I'm hooking it up to all the nexuses that are attached to the current leather pieces. So it's just something basic, like you can see here, just to get started. And it's a little diversion from what Mark was talking about, but I think that the leather, more of a leather direction, could really help sell the tangible aspects of this. But we'll see what he thinks of it. We're just going to kind of go this direction for now, and just make it the same on all of them, the same bump, and propagate it throughout. So that's kind of the texture you can see so far. It's very simple. We're going to take that idea of kind of a grayish base texture for the color and propagate it across the whole thing. Here's a spec map I made that was temp that we'll just throw in there to give you an idea of how the spec responds. I'm just was taking the spec down out of some of the areas, and we might do that for some of the other pieces too. But here's the texture I was talking about, and it's very simple. All I want from this texture for the rest of this process is the gray. So we're going to texture the front pad first, the torso pad. I'm just going to grab a big chunk of this source material. Like I said, I'll include a nice patch of this leather texture in the DVD if you'd like to use it. Easily made. And I'm just going to clone it. This is my source for pretty much the rest of the pieces. And to keep the continuity, I just need to use that same texture over and over. And it'll be there'll be other layers on top of each piece, custom layers, that will create uniqueness for every piece. for this piece, I'm just going to add some shading in the recessed areas and maybe some wear here and there. This is the piece right above the stomach abdomen pad. It has like this ribbing on it, and so we're just gonna create some dirt or whatever inside the ribbing. The one thing about the initial direction that Mark was taking is very synthetic, and we've talked about it a lot. And I think I need to show him some different idea just to illustrate it. But I think the more synthetic you get with a CG surface, the more fake it looks. So to get something that's more tangible, like more you can relate to it, which is like a leatherish texture, I just kind of want to push that a little bit, and we'll see where it goes. This is kind of sort of the development process of the production, so I don't want to rule anything out yet. So I'm just hooking a shader up to this chest piece. Basically just duplicate a nexus that already exists with the same blend properties or the same specular properties, and just import all my file nodes and rehook them up. Pretty simple. I'm going to grab another patch here and start cloning it. I'm reusing some of this white speckly stuff, but I'm going to be painting more of that on myself, so we'll see that process as well. The white areas is just kind of where I figured that the leather would lose its texture and become sort of like a bleached, worn area. So I'm just kind of cloning these around. It's going to be the same process for all the pieces. And it's the best way to do it because we're going to want all the pieces with the same material to have the same exact look. We don't want hue variations in the pieces, or else they're all going to start to look like they belong in a different suit. So using the same source is key. So I'm going to probably remove some of this wear and replace the bottom area with some more. I've got my snapshot wireframe in here so I can kind of see where the placement of stuff is. Right now I've put gray shaders on everything else so that they don't interfere, like when I render it, it won't interfere with how I'm perceiving the texture. They'll just sort of take a back seat. Before I had them all, when I UV'd them, I color coded them all to be different colors. There's a render, but the different colors were to say which kind of surface quality each one was, and that was just working it out in my head as I was UVing it. But at this point, it doesn't matter because I have an idea now of what everything is going to be. The process for this is basically paint, render, paint, render. This kind of work I don't do a lot of 3D package. In fact, all of this, save a few areas, are going to be all Photoshop. So as long as your UVs are laid out good, it's a totally legitimate way of doing it. I usually use 3D paint programs for stuff that's a little more organic, or where there's a lot of seams or things like that. So I'm just playing with the weathering, using a little bit of dodge on one of these layers so that I get a little bit of saturation inside the highlights instead of being constant, and a little more variation in the stroke itself. So I can just use like a really basic sort of charcoal brush to get this effect of worn leather where it's sort of broken away. And just use like a lighten layer. And you can just dial it in and out. Keep all of the weathering on one layer so that they all has the same opacity settings. I don't have to go back and forth and try to match them. Although I do keep the scratches usually in a different layer because I like to control the scratches separate from the weathering. So render this real quick. It's coming along. Some of that's going to be covered up by accessories. I just don't have them visible right now. So let's texture the sleeve. I'm going to use the same process for that. Right now I'm just making a snapshot. I haven't covered this, but basically just UV snapshot option in the UV editor to save out your wireframe. And the new versions of Maya go pretty high res. It used to be 2K, but now it's pretty high. So I'm just going to load that in. And for doing Photoshop texture work, you have to do this on pretty much everything. Otherwise, you have no idea where you're painting. Unless it's something that just doesn't matter. So I'm bringing in some reference that I have. I'm going to take a look at Mark's rendering again, just to kind of get an idea of what we were shooting for, what he was shooting for. The sleeve is right now is very plastic. I'd like to kind of get a little away from the plastic look because plastic bag suit is going to read as a plastic bag suit. So if we put a little bit organic feel to this, a little bit of scratching, a little bit of leathery bump to it, I think it's gonna help sell it. So it's gonna take another patch of this guy. I'm gonna be using this the entire time. Just a nice base. Grabbing different sections. Most of it's the same, but some different scratches and things happening in some of these areas that I'm just going to sort of clone around and make a nice big surface out of. And the resolutions for these maps, I haven't really gone over the resolution. It really is dictated by the aspect or the nature of the project you're working on. So if you're doing something that is being rendered HD, like this project is being rendered at HD 720, which is the middle res and still pretty high res, you're going to want to do decent res textures. For film or higher, HD 1080 is almost the same res as film. So if you're doing those resolutions, all your textures are going to need to be 2K at the very least, depending on the size of the object. For the head, I did 8K, but it doesn't really matter as long as you're just, keeping it relative to the project. It's the best philosophy for texture resolution is to start big and scale down, because you can never scale up without shooting yourself in the foot. So if you have a big texture and you have enough space for all your textures, then just do that and scale it down. And then you can also make resolution variations depending on the shot. So you can make a 1K version of the same high-res texture, and that can be loaded in for some shot where he's dancing around in the horizon and you don't really see him. So I'm saving this out. I haven't really gone over the naming convention that I use, but it's pretty simple. I do a prefix, a descriptor, and then I do a small suffix after the descriptor, and then my initial usually. That's just a work habit, but the initial is usually the name of the asset, or the prefix is the name of the asset. So if it's a shoulder, or if it's geo, actually, if it's the whole character, it's geo. So the prefix would be geo. The descriptor would be the name of the object, and then the suffix would be the type of texture map that it is. So it's an easy way to sort of keep tabs on all your textures and what kind they are, and they all can be dumped into one directory, and you can kind of tell what each one is doing. I actually have different directories for each style of map, and that's just a micromanagement choice. You don't have to keep them all in different directories. So there's the sleeve. It's a little plasticky looking, but we get that bump kind of adds a little bit of a nice feel to it. I think it keeps it from being too like Phong shader. So, and we can also add in a little more texture variation in the specular highlight. That allows it to be a little more natural feeling. I think I told Mark this in the meeting that the specular should have some sort of variation in it. It shouldn't just be a gleam. So we're going to add some wearing on this, I think. It's just the basic color right now, so it needs some sort of custom treatment. So we're just going to use that brush, that charcoal style brush, and start throwing it in there. Where I think the wear areas would be mostly the elbow, and then up where the shoulder, there's another shoulder piece on the very top of his shoulder that I think it overlaps it, so that would have like that would wear on underneath the sleeve, so that the sleeve would start to receive a little bit of wear there and start to deteriorate. So I'm going to put some of that white stuff right there in the armpit and directly below that piece, as well as the crease in the elbow. And I put a little bit here and there too, just to kind of add a little bit of breakup, but the focus is going to be in those stress areas. I'm going to do some creases here. These aren't actual, some of these are scratches and some of them are just from the leather style surface bending a lot and starting to lose its pigment. And some of them can be read as scratches as well because the surface has been removed. So I'm going to save that and render it. I'm running the color map so I can see what's happening with just the color. And it's there, it's a little subtle. I'm not sure what's going to come through once it's got all the passes in there. Right now when I render the render you're seeing, the beauty render in the render view in Maya is just going to be simple beauty with, I think I just did a, kind of like I did on this cigar, I did a simple gray IBL just to kind of fill in the shadows. And that's just kind of where I'm starting from, and like 2 lights. Same exact setup as I've already laid out. So I'm going to add a little more around some of these features. There's some of these raised areas I think maybe would have some wearing along the edges of them. So I'm just kind of painting in some lighter areas to sort of feature those things. And most of my brush work, I'm using just the default brushes and for the most part, just the default brushes in Photoshop. You can get crazy with the brushes, but I think with what's there, you can go pretty far, and you don't need to spend hours making custom brushes. Really, it's not necessary unless there's a very specific a thing that you have to replicate over and over and over and over, which can be the case sometimes, depending on the project you're working on. And then you might need a brush that sort of just does that function that you can reuse over and over. But for this, there's no need really. So I'm bringing out the scratches a little more in the elbow, or creases actually. I want those to be a little more visible. Right now it's quite subtle, and I think the sampling is, since they're such thin little lines, the sampling is creating a problem because from that distance it will blur it into like a kind of a fuzzy mode. And obviously when you get closer you can see it better. So I'm adding more wearing around underneath the pad that's above it. most of this process is the same, just constantly painting and then rendering and then painting. And the beauty about the Nexus is that I don't have to wait for a beauty render every time. Like I can just set it to color mode and preview color mode over and over, and it renders super fast. And then once it's where I think it should be, I can do a beauty render, and then that way your time is a little more well spent using this sort of process. I would do stuff like this in ZBrush as well, but the reason I don't is the fact that there's no layers. So if I had layers in ZBrush, like I do in Body Paint, currently with the version that I'm using in ZBrush, I would do some of this stuff in ZBrush as well. Some of it's coming through a little more. We'll have to reinforce some of that with a 2D bump map. Like I said, I don't want to get too involved with doing a custom bump map for every single object, but there's going to be at least a handful that we're going to need an additional bump map. Like I'm guessing like probably anywhere from 5 to 10 objects that will need to have their own surface quality on top of having that procedural bump. So that's kind of coming through over there. You can kind of see it, and it's coming along. I want to have a nice amount of detail in the bigger pieces of this guy's costume, like the shoulders and the sleeves and the legs. The littler pieces I'm not too concerned about. In fact, some of the buckling and all that stuff can just be textureless as far as I'm concerned. It can be procedurals and shaders that look like metal and plastic and stuff. But there's certain things that definitely need to have a lot of custom attention to them. So I'm just going back and forth. I'm increasing it even more here, and I think that it's going to be needed to come through. We can do, and we will do it later when we composite this thing. We're going to definitely be adding color corrections onto the color to see how it responds to all the other passes, like we did on the head. We're going to see how the color map is hidden or is revealed by the lighting scenarios and the different passes. So chances are this will get very subdued, and we might have to gamma it up or down or add some color correction. But that kind of color correction is actually done better in the development process, in the visual development process, because you can see what the problem is and you can do it interactively, and then you can make note of those changes that you did. If those changes are legitimate and that need to be propagated across all the shots that this character is involved in, you can take those color corrections that you did, note them down, the exact ones you did, go back into Photoshop or bring your texture maps into Shake, either one, and just take those color corrections and just put them on every map, and then save those out. And then every time it's rendered, you'll have taken the color corrections that you've done and worked out just the way you want them in context of what the actual composite's going to be, and have them baked in and not have to worry about it anymore. So I'm still tweaking these textures. I've gotten the side ones laid in at this point. I'm kind of rendering everything together to kind of see how they correlate. Right now what I'm going to do is create a sort of cloth, just using 2 cloth shaders, procedural shaders. I'm going to work on these little straps right here. You can see I've rendered it already. It's very simple. It's just basically a cloth texture pumped into a bump, pumped into a Nexus, but it's just got a gray color. So there's literally no textural information on the strap itself. which can be good and bad. For what we're dealing with, it's not really an issue. If it was a film character or something that had lots and lots of time attributed to it, we would go in and we would hand texture every single thing. But with all the accessories that you see here on this guy, it would take a long time to individually texture each one, and it would also take up probably 100 or more texture maps. So to load all those into every scene every time you render is quite beastly. Actually, right now I'm going to show you guys how to texture something completely procedural. I was making note of the belt here, and the belt is pretty simple. It's just got the segments in it. So I'm going to use the grid to create those segments in the belt using the bump. So that's what it looks like now, and then I'm going to tweak the shader group real quick. All right, so there's the segments, and too big, but I'm just gonna go ahead and tweak the tiling of the grid texture to create these lines in the procedural. So there's these segments that we see in the concept, and I'm just gonna keep playing with it until it gets close to what we see here on the concept, which is just a sort of a segmented, very simple segmented look. But there is a sort of a divot in the top portion. So what I want to do is create that fluctuation in the shape, and the sort of the top to bottom fluctuation in the shape. So I'll be adding that shortly. What I'm doing now is making a color map for this. It's kind of a rust color. And I'm going to do beauty. And I didn't hook it up, so I need to go back and hook it up to the color. Increase the bump just a little bit. So there's a basic grid style texture, and we're going to keep going with this. We're going to push it. I want some top to bottom variation. Like I want the texture to be a little different on the top than it is on the bottom, and I want it to have a sort of a ramp almost. Because no color texture is constant. I mean, some of them are, and some of the ones I'm doing are, but this is just to further illustrate the procedural approach. Normally I wouldn't probably take this much time on the little thing like a belt, but as you can see, I'm doing a ramp that basically says it's brown on top and gray in the middle, and I'm moving it to the top because the UV space is on the very top of the UV grid, so I'm sort of just aligning it with that, and we're going to render to see what it looks like. Right now it's just too big. I'm not getting any brown on the bottom, so I'm going to keep adjusting this ramp so that it is properly in that UV space. Sometimes you need to use a procedural just for speed and for flexibility. So that has kind of a little bit of a rusty kind of variation in it that I'm starting to like. I think the frequency maybe needs to be a little higher of the noise. I've added a little bit of noise to the ramp. So it's looking pretty good. This grid probably could be a little less contrasty because we're getting really dark lines. I don't know if the lines should be that dark because once the shading kicks in, it's gonna darken those edges. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that variation I was talking about earlier in the top to bottom variation, I think, needs to be there. So I want a little bit of bump, a little bit of ridge that's going horizontally along um, the waist, and that will help give it a little more shape, I think. And what I did here is I canceled that out because I had already made a ramp that was in that rough UV space. So I just thought of that afterwards. So now I'm basically tweaking this to be more height based now, with no shading or no interpolation, so that I know that this black band, or this band right here that I'm going to make darker, is right in the middle of the belt currently, because that's where the color was. So now I get a little bit of a lip there on the top. I like that a lot, and I think it is going to be close to what I'm going to be going with. So just still kind of tweaking this. It's pretty close to where I want it. I like the lip on the top. I'm trying to get a lip on the bottom, but I don't think it's gonna happen. And the other one was looking pretty good, so I'm gonna kind of bring it back to the way it was, and just go with that. So there's it so far. I'm going to tweak the color map just a little bit. And this piece will be getting a lot of reflection too, because it's metallic. So I don't want to make the color of it too light, because when you multiply color onto the diffuse, that tells how much light is being absorbed. So if it's not absorbing any light, and then you add a reflection on top of that, it's going to become quite an eyesore. It's going to be very glowing. So we're going to move back to some leather, but this one's going to be a pouch, I believe, and we're going to just do the pouch how we see it on the concept, and it's going to be fairly simple, but once it's done, it can be assigned to all the other pouches, so we can put a little bit of a time into it and go through the whole process. We'll do a bump map for it. His pouches are quite futuristic and have a lot of geometry information that doesn't exist in the actual geometry. So I'm going to go with what Kaj did and use the color and surface quality cues that Mark did. It's going to have to come sort of halfway on that. And the pouches aren't really even going to be seen to that extent. So I'm not worried about them being super futuristic looking. Because they're going to be like 10 pixels big. So the color of the flap is going to be slightly different. It's going to be a warmer color. It's almost kind of purplish at the moment. I'm going to save that as a pouch. And bring in the UV snapshot for this thing so I can see actually where this stuff is. I'm gonna go ahead and render this, I think. I'm gonna take a shader that already has a surface value or properties of the leather that's currently on him, and rename it to pouch and bring in my texture that I made so very fast. And I'm not worried about that it's not done. I just want to see what it looks like. I'm going to assign it to both of those patches because they're the exact same thing. Here's a render that I did. recently that has some of the updated stuff in it, to get an idea of where it's going and how it's being pieced along. But we're just focusing on the pouches at the moment, and right now I think they're too purple as I see it rendering now. But and they're too simple. I think there needs to be a lot more surface detail on them. So we'll just start addressing those issues right away. His costume design there had more of a rust almost color to the top portion of the pouch. So I'm gonna make it warmer, less purple, and we'll try to incorporate that into it. So we're just going to test that color again in relation to the rest of the costume. I'm rendering this beauty with all this stuff just so I get a context of how it's reading with the rest of the costume and in context with the concept itself. So it's still too purple. So I need to go way more brown with this. And the first thing I want to do to start giving this some variation is just to add some weathering on, like I did on the rest of the leather, around the edges, places where it would be worn. Just throwing down some random strokes. I like to use sometimes I like to use the subtractive method where you lay down a big block and then you just start to erase away from it instead of trying to get the first one to be perfect. It can end up being heavy-handed that way, and you get too much. So it's nice to put in too much and then start to tone it back. So it's coming through, but not very much. I think I'm going to want to add a little more, actually, to this. Just keep adding some breakup until it becomes visible. Sometimes it doesn't need to be blatant, but it just needs to be picked up on. It can be subtle. But just the fact that this surface isn't like a constant color. It's not just always the same on all sides. So the edge of the flap would have some wear from being opened a lot. His edges are more hard plastic looking, and ours is going to be more like a soft pouch, like a semi-soft pouch that actually has some aging and wear on it. So we'll render that and see what that looks like. It's looking better. The desaturated and warmer lid of the pouch is much better, and the wearing is looking good. Now to custom texture each of the pieces that you see on the character would be, as you can see, very time consuming. So we'll probably skip some of it, or I'm going to skip some of it and do just quick procedurals for things, metals and plastics like I mentioned before. And I would recommend, if you're doing a similar project where you're not going to see those things and you have time constraints or hardware constraints, to approach some of those things that are smaller and not visible as a procedural. Procedurals can be very useful, and while not as realistic because you don't get the sort of chaotic decision making, you're kind of locked into the different presets. It can still make your life much easier and with very little sacrifice on quality. So I'm just dodging a few areas where I think they would be a little darker. And I think that the top of the pouch here would have some stitching or some variation in the top portion. So maybe it's just raised in the very middle. I'm just trying to get this little arc here that's happening. And I'm gonna do a stroke on this so that I get a little stitching line that happens on the top. And actually, what I'm getting right now is too big of a line, and this one's going to be more of an illusion of stitching and a little bit of shading. Since we're not going to see it, I'm not going to go in and add tons of little stitches. But I might go ahead and just add a line. So I'm just gonna keep adding some stuff in here, continuing these ideas into the very corners of where the snap would be, where the most finger usage would be. I'm gonna add another stitch here, I think. Find the right layer, and let's add another little formation right here, and we'll get rid of the bottom half. Just to kind of give it a little bit of design. Unfortunately, I can't exactly match Mark's design because it wasn't modeled as such, and to add that kind of information into the bump would take a day or two because there's just so much relief happening in shapes. So on something like this, when you have 20 other little accessories, you can't spend 2 days on one texture. So we're just going to go with what Kaj went with and try to support it and make it a little more interesting. So I'm gonna render the color of what I just did. It's not even coming through hardly at all. So we're gonna have to bump that up a lot more. So once we get this piece in, or the color map for this piece situated, we'll go ahead and make a bump map for it as well, because I think it's going to need it. Just because I want a little more surface relief in the top because it's so flat. It wasn't modeled in, so we're going to have to just do our own thing with the bump. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you need to add those variations with the bump map that weren't modeled in, either from not paying attention or from just not having the resolution and the mesh that you need, and just things like that. So this is looking pretty good. I'm going to do a beauty of it, see how much of the color comes through. I'm seeing some of that stitching now. I'm liking where it's going. So we'll just kind of continue with that idea. And do some more maybe in the middle here. We'll see what that looks like. I don't know if it's something that I'm going to want, but sometimes you just got to test some stuff out and see how it looks. So I'm just going to blur that out to look like the other ones. This is more of just a see what it looks like. Test. That's alright, I'm not sure I'm gonna go with that. It's probably not. Now let's try this. Maybe we'll add some wear up on the top portion where it's bending a lot. I'm just gonna keep doing that subtractive process on this. I think it's a good way of doing it. So I'll render this patch again, see what it looks like. It's pretty subtle changes. This is more or less the process for pretty much everything that I'm going to be doing though. Painting each texture in Photoshop by hand using the source leather that we have, and just painting each layer individually and rendering it and seeing how it responds, getting a good base. So I think I'm going to run with this, and we're going to make a bump map out of it, and I'm just going with some of the information I've already laid down, which is these seams, and those are going to be like indentations, I believe, on this, and I'm just going to clean it up on this one as well. And then in between the indentations, I want it to be sort of raised, like kind of puffy. So we'll just select just the inside, not the whole thing, but just the inside, and we'll fill it with a lighter color. We'll do the same on both sides. So that kind of sort of helps reinforce the fact that these dark lines are in fact some sort of stitching or welding of some sort, keeping this thing together. I'm going to blur that so that it has a puffiness, like a nice ramped feel. And I'm going to bring in some of the wear and make that slightly recessed. Like so wherever it's been worn, the bump kind of lowers itself a little bit. And it'll be quite subtle, but it'll help. Sometimes subtle bump doesn't come across too much, but it helps break up the specular so that you don't have like a sheen. It creates more of an interesting specular hit. So I'm going to bring in this bump, see what it looks like. Alright, so let's load this and see what it looks like. You can layer bumps in Maya if you wish. I don't think this one's going to need to have the leather texture on top of it because it has kind of a harder, finer surface quality than the rest of the textures. And I'm just going to go with that. So it's looking decent. I think that the bump and the color on these objects is pretty simple, but it's going to be necessary. So and it'll come out a little more with a different lighting scenario too. Right now, it's getting a little bit of front lighting happening. So What we'll do now is we'll move on to the pants. And this is going to be a long process because there's a lot happening in the pants. But I think the texture that we did, or that we're going to do on this piece is going to really, it's going to basically have the most of everything. So everything that's going into all the other objects is going into this. So this is going to really represent all of the pieces, plus some, because it has some other surface qualities that the others don't. It's got some cloth in the middle, and it's got some different kinds of leather and things like that. So we're just going to start like we started the other ones, and start plotting our leather in here just as a base. So we'll just start cloning that and getting a good base going. I said earlier in the head texturing portion that I don't like mirroring a lot of stuff, which is true for heads, because heads are asymmetry in heads is just a super important thing to do. Here I'll probably add some scratches that are unique to each side, but this leg piece is going to be probably 90% mirrored over. For cloth and props and things that aren't character related, this I don't think it is as important with asymmetry. You definitely need some sort of variation, but usually that can just be another pass on top that just sort of adds things that one side doesn't, and that'll get you through it. So there were some issues with the UVs, but I think we're still going to be okay. I'm kind of looking here to see where the UVs are on the object, and gaining my bearings on where the different pieces are. So that piece right there is his ass, and then his middle of his crotch is right where that loop comes down. So I'm just throwing down the leather in the areas that don't involve the cloth portion of his pants. So we'll just start cloning it, and so I'm adding, I mirrored it, but I'm adding a little bit of change to one side so that it's not completely kaleidoscope, which is a bad effect to have because it just is so obvious. Sometimes it's best to copy paste large chunks and then clone in between the seams instead of trying to constantly brush, clone, and fill out large spaces, and it's going to end up looking really bad. And some people do that, and it's just a slower process as well. And with the large chunks, you can kind of take big chunks and rotate them around. Here I'm just doing a quick change to one of the textures I made. That's the cloth collar portion, and then I'm just adding what I did there. I want that same cloth collar and bump that I made. So that's the same thing that I did earlier on the collar area, which is the only other cloth portion from what I can tell on the concept on the whole costume. So what I want to do is start working on these edges. So this is the border of his leather meeting the cloth portion. And the weave is probably a little large scale, but anything lower and it's just going to end up looking like noise. So we'll just kind of assume that it's a heavy military weave that you can kind of see from a distance. I'm just using a layer mask to mask this out, so I have a editable portion of cloth that I can change without worrying about the edges. And my weave is still separate at this point from the green color, so I can tweak its intensity. It's being multiplied on or overlaid on, and then I can also tweak the hue behind it, which is just a patch of green color. Well, the process of the whole costume is very integrated with Maya, and it's just the way I do things. Some people will do all their maps and then bring them all in and then render them all together and then make changes at that point. But I like to sort of just preview it as I go, and it's kind of an organic process. And once you have an idea of how to lay out base textures really quick, you can just build off of that. If you're very detail oriented and feel like you need to put all the detail in before you render it, this is going to be much slower for you. But if you're able to like block it out and put the rough detail that you're interested in and then render it in context, and then just make changes and then repeat, it can be a good way to keep everything in context of what the actual render is going to be. Instead of, I mean, in production, you're going to only be concerned about what's being rendered in the shot. So if you do a lot of high-res renders of details and do a lot of detailing in your texture maps, and then it's not even seen, then it's a lot of time that's been wasted. I mean, you'll have a really nice asset, but in the overall production way of doing things, it's considered just a waste of time and waste of money. So one thing to think about constantly as you're texturing is to think about where it's going and how it's going to be seen and those sorts of things. So this process sort of lends itself, I think, to that, because I can quickly see how the texture is responding to the mesh, and I can render it in context by rendering it with the same resolution the shot's going to be rendered and the same scale before I've put in a lot of time into the texture. So if I had put in a lot of time into texture, then and all of that stuff's not visible because the camera doesn't even get that close, or it's sampled, or it's motion blurred, which is the case a lot of times. You just spend a lot of time on texture that's not going to be seen. So it's just something to be thinking about constantly. And a lot of artists have issues with that too, because if you're really into the asset and you're really enjoying it and you want to really push it for the furthest it can go, it's hard to just let go and say, well, it's not going to be seen, so I don't need to spend a lot of time on it. So it's a hard thing sometimes to just accept. But if you have the time, though, definitely put everything you can into it. Some assets that I've created for some work stuff, and I know of other people that have created, have went way over what was needed, and that's just because they were really excited about the model. That, and they either were given the time to do it, or they spent a lot of their own time, such as overtime, working on it. So it's really based on the project, but don't spend a lot of late nights on something that you're not going to even see, unless you love it, which most of us do. And this process also lends itself to being able to constantly show supervisors renders. So if you're not done with the texture, but you've got like halfway through texture and you've been doing constant renders of it, then all you do is you just show those images to your supervisor or whoever's reviewing the content. So that's really nice because you don't have to do all the textures and then your supervisor is asking where they are. And at that point, you're like, well, I have a bunch of awesome textures, but I don't know how to show them. So then you'd have to spend a day or whatever preparing them and rendering them and everything. So that can be another advantage to just constantly rendering your work and keeping it in context to what other people are looking for. So as I've been talking, I've just been doing the same process that we've been seeing. Just weathering and adding where there's edges and protrusions and areas where I think that would be grazing up against things. I'm kind of pushing it on the pants because I think that the pants need some sort of weathering, and the pants and the concept and most of the stuff in the concept is very, very clean and like plastic. So I wanted to kind of pick it up a little bit and go with just a little more weathering and natural wear. And the UVs on that pocket area are quite odd, and but I believe that's the inside of the pocket. But let's take a look. No, that's on the outside. So these UVs were kind of really messy, and it's hard to make them out because there's some overlapping. And I know I've talked a lot about not overlapping, but this was sort of the thing where it's either get it done or not have UVs, and basically the UVs for the majority of the object are quite clean. So that's just a production thing that you'll run into. And like I said before, like you'll run into time constraints. So just make sure that you're focused on where the most texture information is going to be when you UV, and you'll be okay. I'm able to squeeze something out of this texture even though the UVs are a little messed up. And fortunately this object is not going to be displaced at the moment, so any overlapping UVs aren't going to, they're not going to have any sort of threat to this, but it could happen later, so I might have to go in later and fix that. But everything is quite clean as far as being able to know what is where. So I can easily just go in and grab those problem UVs and change them. So this pant leg has a lot of things happening, all kinds of little designs and things on them. So it's a long process to get each thing weathered out and given enough attention to, but it will pay off once everything is textured and laid in. So I'm just bringing the same stuff over to the other side so that we can start seeing this as a whole. Mostly mirrored for the overall weathering. I'll probably put in some different scratches in between to sort of help it read without being too symmetrical. But I'm not too concerned with this piece because it's pretty far apart from each other, and I doubt we'll ever see it head on and see the similarities between the sides. So while I'm painting here, I'm just gonna talk about what we're gonna do next. After this, I think we're gonna just do one more piece. There's just a slightly different surface quality. I think we're going to do the knee pads, which are more of a metallic, almost maybe synthetic plastic type material, which will be pretty much the same process, just a little slightly different look. And then we'll be done with the costume, and then we'll jump straight into the setup for rendering it and compositing. Actually, we're just going to do the compositing because we've already covered up setting up our scene for rendering in the head portion. So it's all the same concepts, just use the same exact settings even if you wanted to, bringing in your costume, and we'll render it out with the frame buffers and do a composite of it. And really show how to push the costume into something that looks like something that Mark is looking for. And then we'll also have a meeting with Mark too before we go into that process, just so we can get our bearings as far as where the costume's at, and then make any last minute changes before we do a little composite of our final costume. So I've just brought in texture here, as you saw. Just any texture will do. Just something that will add variance and randomness to the texture. And I'm just doing that for the cloth because I felt the cloth was just too it's just a grid almost of cloth texture. So I needed to have some dirt and some wear and just little things. Nothing specific. I just need to overlay it with some textural information. Maybe some stains. I don't know. Whatever looks good. And each side is slightly different because that is where they're going to meet in the middle. And if it's symmetrical, it's going to be quite obvious. So we'll just make them a little different on each side. Even though the grid, not the grid, but the cloth pattern is the same throughout. So it's looking a little better. We're missing some wrinkles and stuff in the model, but maybe later we'll go through and do a displacement map. It's all based on the time of the project, these kinds of things. For these shots that have been produced, they will not feature the crotch, so it's not something to be too worried about. So there's a little more to be done here. We're gonna start cloning this leather up into the other areas. And once we're done getting this leather and everything, all the surfaces covered with something and getting a little more weathering, we can jump into the bump portion of this and maybe some specular maps for this piece. I'm just throwing in some different wear and tear on the back piece. And I'm not too concerned about how awesome this looks because we do not see it in our shots. So it's more of just a completion, having a complete asset and not having just one piece without texture. And it needs to all be finished. It just doesn't need to have a lot of attention given to it. So we'll just move these pieces across so that we have a full coverage on both sides. And do a little cloning on here so that it's not exactly the same. And then we'll copy over the weathering as well. These are all in separate layers, so pretty easy to just transfer over. So it's getting close on the weathering, I think. I'm just going to save it out. Actually, I'm just going to bring in this button real quick before I move on. This button is something that we're seeing in the concept. It's some sort of rivet or something happening on the base, and I think it's something that we can just put in here really quick. It's kind of a nice little feature that breaks up and gives it some construction elements. What we'll do is we'll sort of separate this area a little bit. And kind of darken it down a little so it feels like another piece. And these rivets are just some rivet I found an image of, a little snap type rivet thing. You can find stuff like this pretty easily. Just edit it into the color space that you need and drop it in. So I've mirrored it over to the other side, and we'll probably give this a test render soon. So right now I'm just gonna, with the color map as Q, I'm just gonna do a quick specular matte. So I'm just gonna quickly throw in black where this green is, and that's just gonna be no specular at all because it's cloth and it's not gonna have any highlights. And then those little rivets I did, I'm gonna make completely white because I want those to have a whole lot of specular information. So I'm just going to copy those back over. Those don't quite line up, so we'll just get those back in there. And then everything in between is going to be it's going to be leatherish, so it can have some speck. So we'll just do it a kind of a grayish color, and we'll save this out as a speck. I'm just doing this before I forget because usually it's nice to have all of the elements that are involved in the shader, all the texture elements, fresh in your mind. So you're thinking about the surface qualities of certain parts as you're texturing them. And so I was thinking about those buttons and how shiny they would be and how shiny everything else wouldn't be. So I just took the opportunity to quickly make a spec map that supported that. And you can go back in later to these sorts of maps and add all kinds of detail to them, but for this kind of thing, it's not that necessary. So we're just going to put together another shader real quick, duplicating the ones that we already made, and then just rehooking up our textures. I'm matching the color of the blend that's on the other ones to that map by just doing a gain, changing the base color. And not completely accurate, but good enough for this test. So the texture's looking okay now. It's got a lot going on. The rivets are looking good. Once we get some bump in there, it's gonna look much better. It's gonna have some depth to it. So I'm just copying those two little layers I did. And they're kind of ugly in the color mode, but it's not really visible. But we'll see. Our edges are more important now that we're going to do a bump. So I'm just going to paint, clean these up a little bit, and they're going to be a little representation of what the bump is going to be. A little recessed around the inside of those rings. The color map for this particular image is actually pretty close to what I want the actual bump height to be. So I'm just gonna run with it, and getting the levels where I want, where the highs are going to be high, and that little channel is going to be kind of a darker gray, so it's going to cause a little bit of a channel. And we'll just darken up the inside as well. And I'm going around the outsides a little bit so that it feels like the cloth is sort of buckling in toward the snap. So that way you'll get like a nice little specular hit on the inside of the cloth that's right next to the button, and that will create a sense of depth and not just like something tacked onto the surface, but that it's actually part of the surface. I'm just reinforcing these values so that they're a little sharper, because in the bump map they could get lost with all the sampling. And I'm just going to take that and duplicate it. I don't feel like repainting that. And we'll just copy that over to the other side. So this is going to make a big difference on this texture map. I think it's going to be a lot more tangible surface. It's going to feel like there's some weight to it once you get like little buckles and or little buttons and things like that that actually have a little bit of depth in them. It's going to cause a little more realism in the render. So I'm going to isolate just the weave part of this this weave texture that I brought in for the overlay, and I'm just going to use the weave part and not the color for the bump. And I've already got the selection worked out, so I don't have to worry about that. I'll just make a mask for those. So the texture on the leather will be the leather procedural that we set up, and then this will be a bump that sort of is layered on top of it. So we'll have all kinds of different surface qualities. The bump that's going to be on there is going to be very, or that's I believe it's already on there, is very subtle, so I shouldn't fight with the custom texture too much, but we'll see how it looks. And all this shader setup that we see is, for the most part, temp. A lot of times I will hand this off to a lighter. The lighters are usually the guys that do the real shader work, and will really get all this dialed in. So I'll probably pass this on as a starting point. Sometimes they like to restart from scratch, but the key is to get the specular values into the range that you want them for the surface, and how they relate to the specular maps that you might have. And if you can get that information to the lighter or whoever's setting up the shaders, then you're going to retain most of what you're looking for. But if you do visual development and you show your supervisor that and they like it, then the lighter's pretty much stuck matching whatever you made. So and then in that case, then they just take what you have and then clean it up. So depending on the pipeline that you're in, you can either have full control, or you can try to pass along as much information to the next person as much as you can, so that you retain the look that you were trying to achieve. Right now I'm just adding some stitching, some basic stitching to the crotch area, so that it seems like there's some sort of fly or something there, and it's not just totally flat. It should help a little bit. It's kind of too far in, so We might have to move that out and add some raised effect so that it feels same idea as the buttons, where all the black areas are surrounded by sort of a soft light area that raises the surface up, and then it creates an illusion that the stitching has a little more weight to it, and it's not just a line, like a straight flat line. So those are kind of what I'm going for. I think it should be farther out because it's too narrow. So we'll just bring these out. Just do a little bit of transform on this. I'm kind of embellishing on what Mark had drawn, and that's okay because there wasn't a whole lot to go off of. I think that maybe this part would definitely be better if we had some displacement maps in here, but sometimes you run out of time. All right, so I think that's good for the pants. Let's just move on to the knee pad, which is pretty simple, and we'll render it in there with the pants just to kind of get an idea of the whole package there in that area. The knee pads aren't going to be seen a whole lot, but they're big enough to where they need their own texture. They can't just be procedurally textured. So I just took a metal texture, just a basic. You can find just metal textures pretty much anywhere these days. Just something that doesn't have too much contrast in it and is kind of a low-key, or high frequency or medium frequency texture that can be used as a base. So instead of just having a gray as a base, we'll have just kind of a low-key metal texture as our base, and we'll just start painting all of our scratches and our wear on top of that. So it's the same idea as the leather. It's just the scratch types will be a little different. It's going to be all scratching and buffed sort of effect, whereas the leather is going to be more deteriorated looking and more organic. But this will have just a lot of scratches. I'm just scribbling scratches all over the place. We're gonna lay some stuff down, and then we're gonna dial it down back a little bit. Might have to blur it a little bit and fade the opacity, but for the most part, I'm just laying down quick scratches. And if I do a blurred version on top of it, it'll kind of soften them out a little. So I'm going to try using one of these brushes here for more efficient scratching, if I can find them. I'm just going to use this texture brush then to break up the existing scratches, which is a good way to do it. It's the subtractive method again, taking out what you don't want. I'm using it as well to lay down some more rough scratches, something that's more less defined actually, and more chaotic. So I'm going to save this out in its current state. The texture for this is pretty simple, and we won't spend too much time on it, but I just wanted to show a different surface style, and this could be also done on the gun that's on his chest. It can be done on buckles if for whatever reason you had time or desire to texture every buckle independently. You could do little metal texture like the one I just made, and then put scratches on it, and do that for every buckle if you wanted. So it can be done on a lot of different surfaces. The dominant surface here is obviously the leather slash synthetic look that is probably 80 or probably 90% of the surface. So that was what where the most attention needed to be put. But there's plenty of opportunity to take these techniques and keep going with them. For this particular character, there's a little bit of restraint based on how we see him in context as a shot. Like if we don't see him at all, then he's not going to be needed to be detailed up like that. So I'm still just doing the same process, rendering and painting. It's using the wireframe as a cue again for where scratches might be. Not sure if this is where a ridge is, but we'll see what it looks like. Body paint would be good for this too, but a little slower because you would have to constantly be going into projection mode, and it takes a little while to go in and out. I like to just lay down as much as I can into Photoshop and then see where the problems are and then fix them. But it's all up to nature of the project again, and the best workflow for you. So I sort of read this as a metallic surface. We'll see what Mark thinks. I think the metallic is nice because you can get away with a lot of like wear and tear, and kind of gives it a little more realism. But we'll just go with this and see where it takes us. And most of the style of the texture or of the surface can be dictated also by the style of the shader. So you can take out, if you want it less bumpy, just take out the bump and make it more shiny, and it feels more plastic. And if you want it more metal, then you add more reflection and bring up the bump a little more. So it can all be tweaked at any stage to make another look more prominent. And these color maps can be infinitely tweaked and shake, so can bring down the contrast if we need to. So I'm just going to add a little wear on some of these little buckles that occur around the knee, and just to make sure that they're not totally boring, and that they match up with the piece that they're connected to. And once we're done with this, like I said, we're going to go straight into compositing this. Of course, we're going to have to show Mark and see what he thinks, but I think overall it's going to be there, and we're going to make any changes after I'm going to make whatever changes are necessary after I talk to Mark, and then the last chapter will be compositing this into an image, sort of a visual development stage, much like the process we take on the head, to really push it and see where the asset is, and what we're capable of with just the textures that have been made, and then we can hand those off to our compositor once he kicks in. And he'll have just a ton of visual cues on how it should look. So the next stage would be to review this with Mark and see what he thinks of the changes, and any additional changes we'll do in the next stage with the compositing.